Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of our conference. My name is Elizabeth Buie, and I've organized this conference, Relationality in American Art, in my capacity as a postdoctoral fellow at the Courtauld Center for American Art. So once again, my thanks to the Center for American Art, to the Courtauld, and to the Research Forum for their help in organizing this event, and to our speakers for all their hard work. So I am just very briefly going to summarize what will happen today, and then I will introduce our moderator for our panel. So today we have one panel called Agency, Subjectivity, and the Relations of Collective Experience with 3 speakers. Those 3 speakers will present their work, and we will then have a 15-minute question and answer session in which we will address questions for all 3 of today's speakers. So please put those in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of all 3 papers. We'll then have a short break at 5:35 London time and return for our keynote today, which will be a talk by Jennifer Doyle called Marxism for Artists, Life in the Iron Mills, Death of the Artist. So it is my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for our panel, our first panel today. Our moderator is Sampada Aranke. She is an assistant professor in the Art History Theory and Criticism Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, who earned her PhD in Performance Studies from the University of California, Davis. Her research interests include performance, theories of embodiment, visual culture, and Black cultural and aesthetic theory. Her work has been published in eFlux, Art Forum, Art Journal, ASAP, October, and Transcripts, an interdisciplinary online journal in the humanities and social sciences at UC Irvine. She has written catalog essays for Sadie Barnett, Rashid Johnson, Faith Ringgold, Sable Elise Smith, and Sable Elise Smith, among others. She is the recipient of the 2021 Art Journal Award for her article, Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes. She's currently working on her book manuscript entitled Death's Futurity, The Visual Life of Black Power. So it is my honor to introduce Sam. Sam, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am so excited to be here with everyone, and I'm so grateful for the invitation and to everybody working magic behind the scenes. So thank you all. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm so excited to be moderating today's panel, and I want to get right to it because we have much time for all this brilliance. But I just want to note a little bit of housekeeping. I'll introduce each panelist before their talk, and then I'll offer up just like a really, really speedy set of comments and open up with a question of my own, and then I'm going to kind of turn it to everyone. So I hope everybody has their best student hat on and ready to ask questions. Okay, so let's begin. Our first presenter for today is Rachel Stratton. Rachel is an art historian and curator of British and American mid-20th century art, who earned her PhD from the Courtauld in 2018. She recently completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Yale Center for British Art and is now working on her book, Grammars of Form: Art and the Crisis of Language in 1950s Britain, supported by a Paul Mellon Center postdoctoral fellowship. Her paper today presents research for a new book project titled Haptic Modernism, which explores Victor Lowenfeld's educational philosophy and the role of haptic perception in the construction of modernist theory and practice. Rachel's presentation today is titled Relationality in Victor Lowenfeld's Social Haptics. Take it away, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Sampada, and thank you also, of course, to Elizabeth and to David and the Research Forum for organising what's already been an incredibly exciting conference. Just a quick note about language before I start. There is some outmoded and offensive language in the form of exhibition titles. Where possible, I've tried to replace this, but it's not always possible. Okay. When the artist John T. Biggers showed his mural, The Dying Soldier, in the Young People's Gallery at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943, the magazine Art News judged it to be little more than, quote, screaming propaganda, end quote, and dismissed the entire exhibition as displaying, quote, a form of race and social consciousness utterly incompatible with sincere artistic expression, end quote. Biggers produced this work, which is now known only through archival photographs and sketches, in response to his call to the Navy draft in 1943. It depicted an African-American soldier crying with pain as he falls to the ground, his mangled body struggling to free itself from the barbed wire in which it is trapped. Around the dying soldier are scenes from the earthly and spiritual life of the African-American man, the manual labor to which he is consigned by his social class, the ever-present specter of a lynching, a man drowning in a slum, and a wife left to raise a child in grief and poverty. From 1946, the mural adorned the foyer of the United Transport Service Employees Union in Chicago, where its primary audience was made up of the African-American workers that belonged to the union. However, when first displayed at MoMA in 1943 in an exhibition showcasing work by Black students at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, a historically Black college, it confronted the museum's predominantly white middle-class audiences with the injustice of a draft that called up African-American men into a segregated army to fight for a country that marginalized and oppressed them. The exhibition, images of which I will cycle through as I talk, was organized by the renowned child psychologist and art educator Victor Lowenfeld. It was among the first exhibitions in the institution's history to include only African-American artists, and in its visceral representation of politically charged subject matter, it offered a counter-narrative to the museum's institutional policy to foster patriotism and promote national security during the Second World War years. In contrast to the dichotomy presented in art news between expressiveness and social consciousness, Lowenfeld made the case that these artists, John Biggers, Junius Redwood, Geraldine Prillerman, and others' social status as African Americans, their experiences living under a system of oppression, was intrinsic to their expressive creativity. He wrote in an essay in 1945 that the African American subject, quote, through his minority status and the restrictions resulting from it, places the self in a value relationship to his environment, end quote, and went on to argue that a similar emotional relationship to the world governed modernist expressionism from Germany and Russia. Lowenfeld's ambition here was to define for white audiences the unique characteristics and history of African American art in order to position the Black American artist as an equal to the white American artist and stake a claim for them in American modernism. In part, this was a response to MoMA's first exhibition of African American contemporary art in 1939, which displayed the work of the self-taught sculptor William Edmondson, and as Bridget Cooks writes in Exhibiting Blackness, presented Edmondson as a native primitive whose work operated entirely outside of modern art narratives. Yet Lowenfeld also fell foul of racist stereotypes at times. As a white man, albeit a Jewish refugee who claimed to understand the trauma of being an outsider in one's own country, Lowenfeld's primitivizing descriptions of the, quote, sensitivity and malleability, end quote, of the African-American artist tapped into segregationist ideologies in the 1940s. The comparison he made between African-American contemporary art and European expressionism emphasized the priority given to representing the artist's emotional and spiritual life over accurate representation of reality. However, it also disrupted the Eurocentricity of Alfred Barr's famous and contentious diagram from 1936, which traced expressionism back to the influence of African sculpture, by adopting a problematic and possibly pseudo-evolutionary narrative that fashioned the African-American contemporary artist as the true artistic inheritor of African sculpture. At Hampton, Lowenfeld encouraged his students to study the impressive collection of African art there and to circumvent Western artistic traditions. At the same time, he invited the muralist Charles White to be a teacher in order to help his students develop a socially transformative artistic language. He urged his students to find creative inspiration in their lived experience of hardship and regarded the redirection of this emotion to the production of artwork as an act of resistance against oppression. Lowenfeld's ideas placed the situational body at the center of experience, calling to mind Maurice Merleau-Ponty's central thesis that consciousness of the world is achieved through the medium of the body. In conceptualizing the African-American self as being in a value relationship with society, He not only recognized the place of the white other in embodied Black experience, foreshadowing Frantz Fanon and Sarah Ahmed, among others, he also opened up the possibility of an alternative system of racial relations founded in intersubjective empathy, a kind of ethics of care, as the feminist Carol Gilligan called it. Understood through phenomenological relationality, Lowenfeld's belief in the necessary self-centeredness of the African-American artist can be read as his attempt to empower the Black artist to reclaim the body as a generative force, both for the development of political consciousness and for artistic production. However, it also submitted to a system of power in which white society defined the Black body. In order to comprehend Lowenfeld's ideas about the relationality of the African-American artist, we must turn to the theory of visual and haptic creative types that he set out in the publication The Nature of Creative Activity in 1939. This psychological study analyzed the artistic methods and outputs of fully sighted and partially sighted white adolescents from Austria and categorized them into two distinct creative types. Visual types, it was argued, took their creative cues from the outside environment and developed a perceptual whole from the fusion of partial visual experiences. As this series of illustration indicates, the visually oriented artist was thought to begin with a plan of the whole schema and later insert details into it. The opposite was said to be true for haptic creatives, who were thought to be primarily concerned with their own bodily sensations and the tactile space around them. As illustrated here, haptically oriented individuals were said to begin with a detail such as the chin and build around it, often focusing on the features or objects most important to the artist, rather than adhering to a rational spatial schema. That both creative types were found to exist in fully sighted and partially sighted adolescents rendered physiological factors such as vision less important as determinants of creative type than quote-unquote psychological attitudes, providing the foundation for Lowenfeld to consider the impact of social status in the development of an artist's creative type. At Hampton, Lowenfeld carried out psychological testing on his students, asking them to complete questionnaires like this one, which consisted of drawing exercises and word and shape association, which were then scored to determine the percentage makeup of visual and haptic creativity in each individual. This approach is dangerously close to racial profiling, especially given the higher proportion of haptic creatives he reported among his African-American students. Yet it should be noted that this did not lead Lowenfeld to draw essentialist conclusions about African-American creativity, but to consider social experience as a determining factor. In an article on the subject in 1944, Lowenfeld wrote, "The art of the African-American necessarily must be self-centered. It must place the ego into a value relationship with his environment. This is not the art of visually minded people who feel as spectators rather than being involved. It must necessarily be extremely haptic." The claim Lowenfeld made for the development of haptic creativity born from oppression put the perceiving Black body at the nexus between self and world. It implied that the trauma inflicted daily on the Black body in the Jim Crow South through restricted access to spaces and facilities, the policing of activity, manual labor, and the constant threat of violence necessarily placed the body self, its muscular tensions, kinesthetic experiences, and touch impressions at the forefront of the African American's experience of being in the world. In this way, Lowenfeld proposed that for these haptic artists, the afflicted Black body was the primary medium through which the artist creatively processed their lived experiences. Take this painting by Junius Redwood, which was included in the MoMA exhibition in 1943 and bought by the institution, making Redwood among the first, I think perhaps the second only, African-American artist to enter MoMA's collection. The cropped frame centers attention on the bodies of the stooped figures sitting atop the cart upon which they rely for survival. The moonlight exaggerates the figures' hunched forms, which emerge from the inky night, giving brief presence to the invisible labor of the night worker. In accordance with the qualities Lowenfeld observed in the work of haptic creatives, schematic details are scant. Instead, the scene unfolds in the limited sphere of the artist's touch space, while the perception of the white other makes its presence felt in the representation of their laboring bodies. Redwood's painting draws attention to the habitual oppression faced by the African-American subject. Merleau-Ponty positions the habit body in a dialectic with the present body, the first operating autonomously to carry out repetitive habitual actions, while the second is that consciousness which is permanently part of one's perceptual field. In a phenomenology of whiteness, Sarah Ahmed draws on this dialectic to argue that for the non-white body operating in white-oriented spaces, as is the case in Western societies, the habit body cannot trail behind action without notice, but is constantly brought to the attention of the present body because it continually presents a barrier to habitual action. Redwood, along with Lowenfeld's other students, would have been made conscious of the otherness of their Black bodies every time they carried out habitual actions, like going to the bathroom or drinking water in a public place. A fact Lowenfeld not only understood, but problematized by refusing to follow the virulent segregationist policies in place in Virginia. Redwood's painting forces the habitual body into the present consciousness of both artist and viewer. Lowenfeld claimed that for haptic artists, quote, the self is projected as the true actor of the picture, end quote, implying that the body, or rather embodied experience, became a site of resistance to habitual oppression, a generative force that gave life to the artwork. The exhibition at MoMA in 1943 was part of an idealistic effort by Lowenfeld to foster quote-unquote racial cooperation. But it did so on the grounds that the African-American artists rendered themselves emotionally transparent. The claim that these artworks were projections of the artist's self suggested that they surpassed mere representation of the African-American experience and instead carried within their line, form, and color traces of the bodily emotion, the affect of their originators, and thus became effective actors within MoMA's galleries. Biggers said of the piece, "The dying soldier is me. I was thinking about all I would lose, and I just began to draw my thoughts." As the reaction of the art news critic illustrates, the presence of the emotive Black body in MoMA's galleries disrupted these white-oriented spaces. Oops, sorry. Indeed, MoMA's acquisition in 1942 of Jacob Lawrence's Migration series was praised in the museum's bulletin for its, quote, quiet, even-tempered, and non-inflammatory pictorial images, end quote. In contrast, Biggers's projection of the self as a fallen martyr writhing in agony deliberately inflamed, not in the propagandist sense suggested by art news, but in the emotion that irradiated from it, dissolving autonomy and rendering the emotive perceiver complicit in his demise. As an affective actor, the painting orients the figure's pain towards the object of the viewer, pain being that sensation which Sarah Ahmed explains defines the body of a perceiving subject and empathically connects it to others. The soldier's wound registers the point where another has penetrated the surface of his body, and the viewer, standing in the place of the perpetrator, is thus drawn into the unfolding drama. The emphasis Lowenfeld placed on the African-American artist's haptic intersubjectivity was designed to empower his students to reclaim the Black body as a creative force for social change. However, looking back, this approach seems rather naive. These works, when exhibited at MoMA, were decontextualized from the site of their production in the Black-oriented spaces of the Hampton Institute Art Studios, and instead placed in MoMA's hierarchical white-oriented galleries. Here, it was imagined that when audiences encountered the work, the effective response would thaw the boundary between subject and object, causing a porosity that first led to self-consciousness and then to social conscience. However, the reaction of the art news critic is a testament to the fact that this was not always the case. Cushioned by the established hierarchies of MoMA's spaces, which oriented around his white body, the critic was able to establish an intellectual distance that hardened his autonomy as a viewing subject, his white gaze fixing the identity of the Black other. Having said this, Biggers's subsequent practice, like many of Lowenfeld's students, was predominantly as a muralist, producing painting for public spaces aimed generally at Black audiences. In this context, excuse me, his grounding in Lowenfeld's relational ethics gained new urgency in the service of political consciousness raising. Thank you.
So our last speaker for this panel is Kimberly Bain. Kimberly is the John Holmes Assistant Professor in the Humanities in the Department of English at Tufts University. Her most urgent intellectual concerns have consolidated around questions of the history, theory, and philosophy of the African diaspora, race, gender, environmental and medical racism, and Black arts and letters. She is currently working on 2 book projects. On Black Breath is a genealogy of breathing and Blackness in the United States, and Dirt, Soil, and Other Dark Matters, which turns to dirt for understanding how Blackness has resisted extractive relations under racial capitalism and shaped global considerations of the Anthropocene. Kimberly's presentation today is titled Black Unrest.
Thank you so much, everyone. Can you all see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep, everything's great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the land from which I join you all today is the traditional unceded territory of the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts people who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. Today, Boston is home to thousands of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. The painful history of genocide, ongoing forced occupation of their territory, and repeated violations of sovereignty perpetrated by invaders and settlers demands reparations. The promise of justice does not need to come in a different time and place. It can begin here and now. Before I begin, I'd like to also thank several individuals and collectives, including Elizabeth, for organizing this entire conference, the team at the Courtauld, who've ensured that everything has run so smoothly thus far. I'd like to thank my moderator, Sam, for reading these papers, my fellow panelists, and also the panelists from previous days. I'm currently in a classroom, and so if at any point I kind of go out or if there's noise, it's because they're currently doing a little bit of work, but I will try my best to be clear. So let us get started. At one point, I considered naming this talk what it's really about. That the hardest part of living while Black is never knowing, never being able to rest. Put another way, any phenomenology of Blackness in an anti-Black world is also the routine, and all the more violent in its mundane nature, experience of unrest. This Black unrest reflects the ongoing histories and necessary practice of Black revolutionary protest, resistance, and refusal. But attending to these movements also demands that we ask ourselves, what happens when we become exhausted? What happens when rest, taken up here as both the affective and embodied period where our thresholds for exhaustion can be reset, evades Black folk? The nature of the world makes Black unrest inescapable, and its dialectical opposite, finding rest, being at rest, an impossibility in Black life. What my talk will seek and fail to theorize are the forms of undoneness that emerge at sites of Black unrest, particularly in Black visual art and its necessary pair, Black social life. Undoneness orients my concern because in my turn to Black visual art and social life, what has consistently emerged is undoneness. Undoneness is a refusal of the attachments, political, affective, social, and so forth, contained in the idea that protest and revolution, propelled as it is by rage and grief, as much as it is ecstasy, is an individual experience. And here in particular, I'm thinking about this idea of the singular or the singularity, which is borrowing language from Christina Sharp, where she defines the sort of anti-Black world that we live in as both weathering upon the Black person, as well as being a sort of larger system that we exist within. When the experiences of the Black body holds exist beyond the ones we feel individually and beyond the times we are able to live personally, Black folk, to paraphrase Fred Moten, cannot ever consent to be a single being. We are never one body. We are more than one, though perhaps less than two. Undoneness and unrest, then, hover at the edges of multiplicity. They are a mode of movement, amplification, intensification, and reverberation. It is this undoneness, and it is Black unrest that I will explore in two texts. First, the Washington, D.C. 2021 Memorial for Breonna Taylor, and second, the 2017 visual art piece by Jabez Khalil Huffman entitled Dance Card, or How to Say Anger When You Lose Control. I will explore Black unrest and undoneness specifically through the feature that defines each of these texts, namely footwork. And finally, I will end with a brief return to a consideration of the impossibility of Black rest. Elizabeth Alexander's meditation on Black Americans' long relationship to images of anti-Black violence in Can You Be Black and Look at This? Reading the Rodney King videos remains prescient despite its publication almost 2 decades ago. In particular, her analysis of how community forms within this visual economy of anti-Blackness remains urgent for my consideration of how the visual economies of anti-Blackness seep into our mourning practices as well, especially when we mourn and remember Black women. It might be for this reason that remembering Breonna Taylor and honoring her life has been a fraught act, especially given the commodification of her death. For example, just this past year, a BreonnaCon, including a, quote, tailor-made women's empowerment event for, quote, beauty, power, and justice, as well as a BBQ, was ostensibly organized to, quote, honor all the lives lost to police violence. To be Black and to see these posters, the neoliberal commodification of Black death through a visual calculus that makes the Black dead, that is Taylor's image and her memory, an afterthought, washed out by the deep purple of the poster and overwhelmed by large text displaying the names of the influencers, performers, activists, preachers, and so forth. To be Black and to see these posters is to be reminded again that the visual economies of anti-Blackness and misogynoir can form under the thin veneer of a community gathering. Capitalism will sell our own death back to us, and folk will be eager to call it empowerment. But I am less interested in those moments of anti-Black and capitalist consolidations of Black mourning, a consolidation that flattens Blackness, and more in instances where we get something like this. The night of March 13th, 2021, a vast crowd of masked protesters convened to hold a vigil in memory of Taylor. In the video recorded and later posted to Twitter by Anthony Tillman, the participants gathered in the deep twilight of the night and danced before an enlarged picture of Taylor, her image illuminated by the tender yellow glow of candlelight, flowers strewn everywhere, a set of speakers blasting Mary J. Blige's Everything. Bass reverberates through the space. The brassy notes of a trombone, played in real time by Sterling Anderson, accompanies the rise and fall of the protesters' voices as they sing along, dance along, nod along, sway, bawl, smile, shuffle, bounce, hug, cry. They are moved by and are moving to what she loved. As Alexander asked, can you be Black and look at this? I wonder its inverse. How can you be Black and not look at that? When seeing is fraught, Black folk are fortunate to see, whether virtually or in person, what might be called the practices of ecstatic mourning. As Aliyah Abdur-Rahman offers us in her essay, The Black Ecstatic, the ecstatic is an assemblage of attachments, affective dispositions, political aspirations, and representational practices that punctuate the awful now with the joys and possibilities of the beyond, of alternate worlds and ways. Differently articulated, the Black ecstatic is capable of fashioning as well as intensifying moments of world-making simultaneity. These moments, or better described as movements, of simultaneity in turn are capable of piercing the anti-Black conditions that resulted in Taylor's death. Sean Crawley describes these kinds of textures, these moments, as a kind of social ecstasy. He says, quote, "Rather, social ecstasy is the conception that the condition of possibility for life is undoneness as ontological priority, an irreducible, unreachable doneness, a horizontal undoneness." As Crawley reminds us, undoneness, or we might say unsettling, whatever we might call the condition of the individual, is precisely the ontological and phenomenological priority for the refusals of Blackness. The vigil, a cacophony of mourning, of joy, of nothing less than rage, is a site of Black unrest, able to conjure for viewers and participants alike a sense of undoneness. What I am trying, and again, am failing at articulating, precisely for the hope of retaining the opacity at the core of these moments, to attend to in this video is that, even as we, for this brief moment, get something approaching the textures of being laid to rest for Taylor, what undergirds this entire scene is unrest. That unrest is marked most potently in the protesters' footwork, with emphasis, of course, in this moment placed upon the sort of language of work, right? The kind of labor that's being taken up at this moment. The dancing we see in the vigil recording has a long history of being part of varied Black mourning practices. For example, the second line parades in New Orleans that are organized by social aid and pleasure clubs, or the Black Lives Matter protests that continue to blossom globally. We might even think, for example, when Langston Hughes wrote, "To whirl and to dance till the white day is done," he meant something like this. Here's another perspective to get us closer, but not get us any more clarity. Dance Card, or How to Say Anger When You Lose Control, is a 2017 piece by visual artist and writer Jubaid Khalil Huffman. As an artist steeped in Black visual tradition that privileges projection repetition, Huffman's dance card deploys footprints, or more specifically footwork or dance diagrams, in a convoluted assemblage to say, quote, anger. Dance card is endless movement. It's the lenticular overlapping and palimpsestic amplitudes of movement. It's shuffling feet, it's overlapping bodies. It is rage written in movement and footwork. I've tried and failed to follow with my eyes the pathway and the footwork of the piece, and I don't think we're supposed to in any case, as the image escapes capture by systems of commensuration. Rather, the footwork intimates a body undone. We are faced with innumerable bodies, the geometries of Black life released in the artwork and amplified and intensified, each line and each footprint speaking to the reverberations of undoneness on the blank space of the canvas. All that being said, when I first stood before Dance Card in the gallery, I knew those movements. I knew the 1-2 step, the downbeats on the 2-4, knew my body would follow after my feet if I'd given it a chance. I was moved by this piece, literally my weight shifting from foot to a sound, something like a guttural wail that I could not hear, but I could feel as surely as a bass line. Is Dance Card then not precisely the video of the protesters? Does its frantic pace not leave one exhausted and ready for rest? In placing these two texts into simultaneity, something emerges, namely the ambulatory gestures of the feet, in Huffman's case, the palimpsestic and layered footprint notations, and then the swaying, hugging, bouncing bodies at the memorial. They map the cartographies of the individual subject overwhelmed and undone, a collective unrest. And this undoneness necessarily emerges from the practice and at the site of unrest via gestural simultaneity. Black unrest, then, is a site, it is an experience, and it is a practice that is necessarily collective, even in the absence of a plurality of physical bodies. What I'm trying to say is that it never arrives alone. It collects large and small, material and intangible forms. It is a blossoming of collective force. And both texts summon the absent yet present Black dead, articulating the fugitive moments and movements of the Black living as a means of putting Blackness, which is already a necessarily multiple, to rest. In short, through undoneness and unrest, we are unmade and emptied, and in this emptying, the capacity to rest emerges. Where I want to end is with something that I can't let go of. I find it impossible to put out of my mind that Taylor was attempting to rest when she was murdered by Louisville police officers, especially for the way that her murder coincided with irritating public debates that, quote, Black women were going to save us all. Black women drafted yet another fight that never ends given the absence of a defining clause. That is, save y'all from what? And for what? Taylor was a Black woman deemed an essential worker and a hero in the midst of the pandemic, and a Black woman killed while seeking rest in the private sphere. And when Black Americans in aggregate already sleep less and have poorer sleep quality than other groups, it seems that in an anti-Black world, there is only one way we can be put to rest. All other forms of rest, whether it be sleep or comfort, or the luxury of sitting in our beds in the unbroken sanctity of our homes, evade us, sand trickling out from clenched and raised fists. The postures and positions of Black exhaustion can never translate and metamorph into the postures and positions of rest. Nonetheless, I wonder, and I have wondered today, even as unrest can feel like dying, it can still animate the work that we do. And maybe it is then that we can find a time and place to rest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back after, as Sam said, the speediest break of all time. It is, again, my pleasure to introduce Elisa Schwartz, who will be the moderator for our keynote by Jennifer Doyle. So Elisa is an artist and theorist who takes a queer and feminist approach to reproductive labor and language. Her work has been shown in the Athens Biennial, Sculpture Center, and Art in General, and published in Whitechapel Documents in Contemporary Art, TDR, and the Brooklyn Rail, among other venues. She was a Helena Rubinstein Fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program and earned her PhD in Performance Studies from NYU. And Elisa will now introduce Jennifer Doyle for our keynote tonight. So take it away, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for joining us, and especially also to the panelists on the panel before. I think this is a really amazing sort of tone that you've set for the conference and for this transition to the keynote by Jennifer Doyle. One thing that I was thinking about is, coming out of the last panel, is how creative work can offer a lens into the networks of relation that hold us, historical, political, and affective, and I think relevant for the work we're about to hear, pedagogical. And with that said, if for those of you who haven't checked out the shared Google Doc from the Marxism for Artists reading group that Jennifer Doyle shared, I believe it's available on the conference page. I'll post a link in the chat in just a second. I really, really recommend that you do so. It is an amazing map unto itself. So with that said, I would like to introduce Jennifer Doyle. Jennifer Doyle is a professor of English and founding director of Queer Lab at the University of California, Riverside. In her books, Hold It Against Me, Difficulty and Emotion in Contemporary Art of 2013, and Sex Objects, Art and the Dialectics of Desire of 2006, she writes brilliantly about affect and desire through the art of, among others, Thomas Eakins, James Luna, Carrie Mae Weems, and David Wojnarowicz. She was the 2013-14 Fulbright Distinguished Chair at the Center for Research in Transnational Art, Identity and Nation at the University of the Arts London, and is collaborating with Jean Vaccaro on Scientia Sexualis, an exhibition for the Institute of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, which will be part of the 2024 Getty Foundation Festival, Art and Science in LA. Working at the intersection of queer and feminist theory, art history, affect, literary studies, and sports culture, Professor Doyle's writing challenges disciplinary boundaries and historical erasure. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jennifer Doyle.
Hi, thank you. It means a lot to have that introduction from Elisa, whom I've known for a really long time and whose work was really important to the development of Hold It Against Me. So it just really warms me to have you here. And then I also want to say, as another presenter who is located in an English department, but who's been working in art history since the early 90s. So I've been working in art history from outside some of the disciplinary spaces of art history. I never take for granted invitations to speak in forums like this. I really treasure being in conversation with everyone here and listening to all this new and exciting work. It's been really great. So I want to just thank everyone for all that they've contributed so far. I'm actually going to jump in. I have a ton of thank yous and the like, but the material I'm about to present, I'm going to try to pack in a lot, and I'm going to try to live up to the keynote from yesterday, Caitlin Cherry's amazing graduate seminar in like 90 minutes. It was so great. Anyway, so I'm going to do something somewhat similar insofar as this is more of a pedagogical presentation in that I'm not reading from a script. I'll be presenting from this slideshow. If you scroll up in the Zoom chat, you'll see that I've shared a link. It's actually to a copy of this, so you can go onto that and it's not going to disrupt my presentation in any way. You can download it. And I've also shared the annotated Google Doc for the short story that's going to be the center of my discussion. Let's see, so I'm going to go right to present. And also I wanted to encourage people to contribute to the chat if they have questions as we go. I know sometimes that can be hard to do, but I'll see if I can't keep my eye on it and respond to any questions or comments and observations that pop up. I'm going to start just with this first slide and just introducing this talk. This is a talk that's about an 1861 short story by the author Life in the Iron Mills. I wrote my dissertation around the subject of realism and in art history and also in literary studies. So I was looking largely at work of the late 19th and early 20th century, and I was interested in the aesthetic ideology of realism, and in particular, the sexual politics of that. So it's kind of a Marxist feminist dissertation on realism. I've never published the dissertation, nor did I publish the writing there on Rebecca Harding Davis. My work has shifted a lot over the years, and I've been returning to Life in the Iron Mills, text that I've been teaching pretty regularly since I was hired in '99 at UC Riverside. And over the past few years in particular, I've wanted to share this text more and more with artists, and also with the community of people that work most closely with artists, meaning art critics, art historians, studio arts faculty. It's an incredible short story that raises so many of the big questions that are haunting art practices right now. For example, we can turn just to the Strike MoMA, activist effort to raise awareness about the implication of arts philanthropy, the politics, right, of that kind of wealth and its relationship to especially contemporary art, but not only. I'll just share my own work in the art world as a member of Human Resources Los Angeles has led me to start researching the source of the wealth of private foundations as we gear up towards a capital campaign as an arts organization. Just seeing how ubiquitous, say, for example, wealth that is built on the financial speculations entangled with illegal settlements in Palestine, for example. That's a very significant factor in the story of some specific philanthropists and their involvement in the arts nationally in the United States. Warren Kanders, people know that story well, at the Whitney in Campus X Campus Security, that opens with a conversation about a pepper spray, the use of pepper spray on student protesters at UC Davis. And the pepper spray that was used was actually manufactured by one of his companies, a company called Safariland. Anyway, these issues are really almost like kind of an overwhelming, in a good way, kind of presence in the contemporary art world at the moment. And that's really, these are the issues that are in play in Life in the Iron Mills. a story which is written really before you have the articulation of contemporary, arts institutions as we know them today, right? A story that was published in 1861 in the Atlantic Monthly, and at the dawn of the US Civil War. Sorry, I have to shift my screen. There we go. So, so this was her first, this is Rebecca Harding Davis's first published fiction. She had a long career and took up a lot of really like kind of big political questions in her work. Reconstruction, the period right after the end of the US Civil War, the dispossession of Native peoples. She wrote stories that were actually situated in the antebellum period in which she talked about the leasing of enslaved people, in particular, the story of a boy named Blind Tom, who was a pianist and likely autistic. And anyway, so she wrote about like really intense subjects and was widely read across much of her life, although by her later years and by the time of her death, she was largely forgotten. She had a son named Richard Harding Davis who became kind of eclipsed her in terms of his visibility, of course. And I say, of course, because he was a man. So she was completely forgotten in the 19th century in terms of literary study, and then recovered in 1972 with the feminist press edition of Life in the Iron Mills. And Life in the Iron Mills was one of the first texts that was recovered by this press. The other, some of you may also know Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which is, like Life in the Iron Mills now, very frequently taught. Both are, I would say, canon in terms of American, the teaching of American literature. Okay, so I want to just give you a basic kind of plot overview before I kind of dive into a reading of the story. Actually, I'm going to minimize the screen a little bit because sorry, I always get into this trouble with Google Present, so I'm just going to minimize the screen a bit so I can see where I'm going and navigating. In this story, Hugh Wolfe, that's the central character. He's a Welsh immigrant worker in an iron mill, and basically the scenario of the story is that he has the soul of an artist. So he's a wage laborer with the soul of an artist, and he carves startling sculptures from coral, which is a waste product similar to slag, he does that in his spare time, right? So that's already kind of a very overdetermined situation for the Marxist critic, for the Marxist critic thinking about art and value. Insofar as, you could think of him as maybe stealing time, although he's sort of working in what should be like his leisure time, his time for recovery, to prepare himself for labor. So he carves these sculptures on the factory floor. And in this story, the kind of the centerpiece of the story, a bunch of bourgeois white men are on a tour of the factory, and the tour is led by a capitalist named Kirby, the factory owner. And each of the men in this group kind of represent a type, the kind of type that you see in literature which has a kind of cause of social reform of one or another, where they represent coherent political positions and they debate those issues in the novel. So you have Kirby, the capitalist and factory owner, Mitchell, who's kind of a philosopher and aesthete, and Dr. May, who's a good liberal, right? Those are the main three characters in that group. So these men come across this sculpture and they're completely floored by it. It's a visually startling, lifelike sculpture that it's a clear manifestation of the worker's talent as an artist, arguably his genius. There's a lot about the sculpture, like as Rebecca Harding Davis writes it, that it describes that the form a kind of sublimity, that it's it's kind of terrifying, it's just an unusual thing in lots of different ways. Anyway, they debate what Kirby, the capitalist, owes to this worker, right? These men are like, do you just leave these men to labor all day, like men with talent like this? Don't you have some obligation to support the realization of his capacities as an artist? And of course, Kirby is like, I don't care. And I'm going to talk more about that debate in a second. But the basic plot is that he has a cousin who's, Hugh has a cousin who's watching this from a rag heap where she's sleeping, or a pile of ashes, I think. She's pretending to be asleep, and she listens to these men debate, what they owe him. Her takeaway is that he doesn't belong in the factory. So she picks one of their pockets and then hands the money that she's stolen to Hugh, and she tells him that he needs to get out. And he takes the money and wanders around the town, which is Wheeling in what was then Virginia, but what becomes West Virginia, and doesn't know what to do with himself. And that's actually a quite beautiful section in the story, because he wanders into a church and there's just lots of meditations on beauty there. And he's sort of lost in a fog, in a sense. And then he gets arrested, thrown in jail, and there he commits suicide. So it's a grim story. It's the grimmest of grim stories. And it concludes with a kind of unsatisfying conclusion where the cousin, who also goes to jail, she serves her sentence, and when she comes out, there's this Quaker there to meet her, and the Quaker takes her off to the countryside, and there she lives. She kind of goes off screen. We don't know what happens to her beyond that. The narrator kind of winds the story up by dropping us into the narrator's home, and which is in this town, and in that home is the sculpture, right? And we are left with this image of the sculpture in the author's home behind a curtain. So you can see there's just lots in this story that's really fun to teach. But as I was been working on it and thinking about this story, I found myself wanting to share it in the context of a several months long seminar on Marxism for artists, right? Not only for the conversation that it forwards about the problem of value, and this goes to the last panel that we were kind of, just about to talk about, the problem, like, the difficult relationship between use value, for example, and something like a sculpture. And then the crisis around use and value, right, that we have in terms of the product of Hugh's labor, when that product is not actually in the service, right, of capital, and not in the service of the capitalist in particular. So there's a kind of obvious, story there just on the surface of the narrative. But it always interested me that this story about the misery of the conditions of the wage laborer and the violence of that, in a story that was written in April 1861 at the dawn of the US Civil War in Wheeling, Virginia, which is a border town. Virginia is a slaveholding state. So, it just struck me like, wow, we have this really incredible story that's about wage labor, industrialization, immigrant labor, exploitation, class, ethnicity. All these things are sort of circulating in there, but their presence of slavery is only kind of, it registers in the background, but it registers very powerfully in the background. So if you got a chance to read the story, you know that the river that goes through the town is described as Negro-like and bearing its burden. And so while the burden in the story is kind of literally like coal and the products, right, that are kind of feeding the factory and coming out of the factory, no river in a border town, when you talk about a Negro-like river bearing its burden, you can't not think also about the story of being sold down the river, the function of the river itself within the US slave economy, right? So it always interested me that Davis isn't explicitly writing on that in this story, and it's kind of been like an open question for me over the years. And so over the years, I've started to read this story through the work of W.B. Du Bois and his text, Black Reconstruction in America, which opens with a very incisive and really necessary reading around the figure of the white worker and the Black worker, and the historical failure of white workers to identify the problems, right, that are structuring their relationship to wage labor as in a direct relationship to, what is later called racial capitalism, right? So I recommend the opening 2 chapters of that book for people who are looking to kind of, work that stuff out. But I just want to share some of the historical context for this story, because it really helps to kind of, for me, kind of shift the conversation a bit for thinking about the problem around the value of the art object, but then also this particular form that they encounter in the factory, which I'll talk about in more detail in a few slides down, right? So Wheeling, Virginia, actually, I'm going to skip ahead just so I can get the map up, right? So Wheeling is over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And here it is here. Wheeling is in a city that is in West Virginia, formerly Virginia, and it kind of moves up right into the space in between Pennsylvania and Ohio. Ohio's on this side. So these are two free states at the time, and this is actually a slaveholding region. And Wheeling is one of the first sites of full industrialization in the United States. So it's just a bit downriver from Pittsburgh, which is right here. So this goes to yesterday and Siobhan's discussion of Fraser's work around steel mills. There's a direct relationship between Wheeling's development and Pittsburgh, both as sites of industrial production. And then Wheeling has just this very strange story, right, as a site of industrial production in a very early moment in the United States in terms of this happening in the antebellum period. And there's a relationship between that fact, right, and the fact that West Virginia forms after the outbreak of the Civil War, as half the state actually secedes from the Confederacy. It is the only state in the United States to actually have that particular history. And one might say that the state has been taking a beating ever since, and is probably one of the most important sites for thinking through, right, the relationship between whiteness, class, blackness, right, in American history is through the kind of idea, I'll say, of West Virginia. So Rebecca Harding Davis's story is a part of that. It was a really important part of that history, as is Wheeling. I like to use Mary Louise Pratt's term, a contact zone, for understanding what Wheeling, what Virginia was, right, in the 1850s and 1860s. I could go right back to maybe the 1840s. So she uses the term to refer to a social space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, and their aftermaths as they are lived out in many parts of the world today, right? So the term is often used for border locations. So for example, Tijuana, Juarez in the United States would be two border cities. And the larger border regions that around them. But for Wheeling, there's an obviousness to this, but in terms of its status in between two free states and as a site of industrialization, but also kind of woven throughout that is that this whole region has significant histories of immigration of European immigrants from Germany and Wales and England, but and more, right? So, but you had a lot of German immigrants, refugees really, who were fleeing the revolutionary upheavals of the 1840s, relocating to this part of the United States. And so these are German immigrant communities that represented different sides of revolutionary struggle, but you had significant communities of socialists activating in the region and very involved with labor organizing through this period. And so I got really interested in this because some part, I've always, I've wondered, like, from the outside, when you're not like kind of steeped in 19th century American literature, one might be surprised to learn that people were like, reading socialist writings across this period, right, in the United States, but especially in this region. So I think I've said some of this already, that it has a really interesting location. But I also want to say, too, that Wheeling at this period before the Civil War was a home to significant numbers of Black workers, enslaved and free. And that we see this in the story. And I'll talk about, if I get time, I'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a few other things about West Virginia I'd like to share, right, as more kind of in the terms of background. That we're in the greater Appalachian region, and that people have lived in the Appalachian region for thousands of years. And Wheeling is on lands traditionally cared for by the Shawnee. The Cherokee were stewards of the southern part of West Virginia. In the kind of the history of Indian removal in the region, an important part of that is the Treaty of Hard Labor, which is an agreement that exiled Cherokee from what is now West Virginia and pushed indigenous people westward. And it is one of the kind of important models, if you could call that, model treaties that were signed and broken. And this is a key instrument of what Marx called so-called primitive accumulation. And the story of primitive accumulation is really important to thinking about life in the iron mills and Davis's story. But it's all actually pushed into the background and the edges, which is actually a feature of primitive accumulation insofar as it rests in our consciousness as something that's already happened and is in the deep background, is in a kind of historical background. And more recent critics, say Glenn Coulthard and his work in Red Skin, White Masks, he writes there about the ongoingness of primitive accumulation, which is a really important dimension of the story of the interaction between Native communities, Native nations, and the nation state, right? Insofar as that dispossession has to keep on happening in the here and now. And that we have active ongoing resistance to those scenes and sites of primitive accumulation and stories of indigenous resistance now. But I wanted to note that in 1863, when West Virginia seceded from the Confederacy and was recognized as a state, it may have been as a free state, meaning no slavery, but it was still very much segregated in that residents were either white or colored. And status Indians, meaning people who are recognized as members of certified members of federally recognized tribes, were in West Virginia barred from owning land and from voting. West Virginia law prohibited identifying tribal identity on birth certificates, and so those laws have a relationship to anti-Black laws and regulations, where those laws are governed by a one-drop rule. One can be legally Black even if most of one's ancestors are white, for example. These regulations function, right? These regulations function to erase indigeneity, right? In a kind of inverse relation. There are today no federally recognized tribes based in West Virginia, which is an astonishing fact. And that's because Native people were identified as colored and as assimilated, right? So one or the other. Many people opted to pass as of European ancestry, meaning like Portuguese or Spanish, to evade being identified as non-white. And so Native people were not allowed to even own property in West Virginia until 1960, right? And in the slide presentation, I have more like resources for understanding that. And then another kind of context for the story, and that's really like, once you know this, there are scenes in the story that you really can't unsee, and you see very differently. So in Wheeling itself, enslaved people were not less likely to work in factories, but they were mainly like domestic servants in the city itself. But across the region, slaves worked in agriculture, industry, and also in domestic service. And I point this out partly because when people look at the history of West Virginia, there's a tendency to minimize the presence of slavery, given the state's development into a state that secedes from the Confederacy. And I'm fixated on this because in Wheeling, at the time that Rebecca Harding Davis is writing the story in 1860, slavery was a living, breathing human fact, right? And in fact, the marketplace, the Wheeling Market House, which is pictured here, it hosted weekly slave auctions, right, during this time period. And so I have some more, there's some stats available, that in the early 1800s, 7 to 10% of all people in West Virginia were enslaved. And there's a salt mining region. It was the largest area for salt mining and salt production in the country. And it's a really brutal, brutal, brutal form of labor. And so you would have, say, for example, slave owners would actually, or rather the salt mining companies would lease slave labor because it was actually cheaper for them to lease slaves rather than care for them over the duration of their lifetime, because of course they're so debilitated by the labor. So you had this kind of disposable, I'm sorry to use that language, but this is the reality of how enslaved people were treated around on this particular industry, like disposable slave labor as a major feature of the economy in this region. And then also historians have observed that the location of Wheeling and this whole part of West Virginia was attractive to capitalists who, say, for example, might live in Pennsylvania or Ohio, but like want to grow their business, right? They would move across the border to the slaveholding region in order to exploit slave labor and grow their wealth. So West Virginia has a really heavy implication, right, in the story of racial capitalism, and that's actually in the background of Davis's story, right? So I'm going to scroll back up so that I can get to the story itself. Okay, so I just wanted to lay out. I know that's our kind of a really big kind of framework, but I wanted to sort of have that in your mind as you kind of drop into this scene in this factory. The very opening of the story, we get the narrator's really kind of characteristic voice, where she describes the kind of overwhelmingness of industry in the town. The unsleeping engines groan and shriek, the fiery pools of metal boil and surge. Only for a day in the week, in half courtesy to public censure, the fires are partially veiled. But as soon as the clock strikes midnight, the great furnaces break forth with renewed fury. The clamor begins with fresh, breathless vigor. The engines sob and shriek like gods in pain. And then we have this cousin who becomes the thief, going basically to the factory to bring Hugh his dinner. And then you have this kind of interesting voice of the writer, the author, the narrator. Perhaps if she, Deborah, possessed an artist's eye, the picturesque oddity of the scene might have made her step stagger less and path seem shorter. But to her, the mills were only summit devilish to look at by night. And throughout Davis's writing, you get that little twist around the aesthetic eye, right? That there's this kind of aesthetic dimension to the world that Davis is depicting, but there's something twisted, right, in looking at that world that way. That's actually made very explicit in scenes that I won't really be looking at in any great depth. So I just want to, share with you the language in that it's this extraordinary scene where they come across this sculpture, right? So we have Mitchell in this group, right? He turns a corner and he sees the white figure of a woman faced him in the darkness, a woman, white, of giant proportions, crouching on the ground, her arms flung out in some wild gesture of warning. And he's like, I thought it was alive, right? In essence, it's like he's come across some kind of a monster. And then Kirby touches it, right? This goes to the haptic and our conversation about sculpture earlier. Yesterday, not marble, asked Kirby, touching it. And then one of the lower overseers stopped, coral, sir, right? And then they begin to discuss it. And then we get this description, more detailed description of the form. And so I just want to remind you, this is 1861 in the United States, right? So, so I'm just trying to, for those of you who are familiar with American art history of this period, just imagine if this sculpture was real and publicly displayed, what that would mean. Right. There was not one line of beauty or grace in it. A nude woman's form, muscular, grown coarse with labor, the powerful limbs instinct with some poignant longing. One idea, there it was in the tense, rigid muscles, the clutching hands, the wild, eager face, that of a starving wolf's. The young man laughed again. Oh, sorry, I'm just, this is just a more discussion just about what the sculpture looks like. And Kirby is just nonchalantly, I have no fancy for nursing infant geniuses. I suppose there's some stray gleams of mind and soul among these wretches. The Lord will take care of his own, or else they can work out their own salvation. I have heard you call our American system a ladder which any man can scale. Do you doubt it? Or perhaps you want to banish all social ladders and put us on a flat tableland, right? So that's a reference to socialism in the period. So. Kirby kind of warms to his subject. This is a capitalist again. And then there's a stunning kind of paragraph. I tell you, there's something wrong. And this is, just very true of a kind of Marxian sort of framework, which is that it's the capitalist who is the best theorist of capital. There's something wrong that no talk of liberté or égalité will do away. Oops. I don't know how I did that. Sorry, I don't know how I did that. Okay. It had the making of men, it has the making of men, the men who do the lowest parts of the world's work should be machines, right? If I had the making of men, these men who do the lowest part of the world's work should be machines, nothing more, hands. It would be a kindness. God help them. What are taste, reason to creatures who must live lives such as that? He pointed to Deborah sleeping on the ash heap. So many nerves to sting them to pain. What if God had put your brain with all its agony of touch into your fingers and bid you work and strike with that? And then below he says, I do not, I don't think about these things. I wash my hands of all social problems, slavery, caste, white or black. My duty to my operatives has a narrow limit, the pay hour on Saturday night. Outside of that, if they cut coral or cut each other's throats, the more popular amusement of the two, I am not responsible. So, I could just go on about that quote forever, but I just want to stop and imagine that figure, right? So we have this crouching nude woman and arms flung open. And when I shut my eyes and I try to imagine kinds of points of reference, they go to like Rodin and Camille Claudel. But Rodin's Crouching Woman is extremely compact, right? And then Camille Claudel's The Implorer, she's the figure in the story is actually one I picture as one in an agony, right? It's very agonistic, and her arms are flung open. Like that's actually a very provocative posture for especially a female nude. I'm not even sure you can really call the work as it's described in that way. When you look to images of the 19th century and 19th century sculpture and representations of the female nude, crouching women, right? These two images are the two dominant kind of visual points of reference for me as a reader of this story, and certainly for readers of this story and for Davis herself, right? So we have the very well-known engraving, Am I Not a Woman and a Sister, right? Half clothed, kneeling and in a supplicating posture with chains on her wrists. Of course, that was very widely reproduced as an abolitionist emblem. And then you have the more like the weirder story of Hiram Powers as the Greek slave, which was widely reproduced, enormously popular sculpture of the 19th century, also a very controversial work. So for its depiction of a naked woman enslaved, right? There was a kind of contradiction in the way that it was received, because this was seen as like a, the Greco, I'm trying to remember, like Turkish war. So it's like a reference to white slavery, right? This is actually kind of like the surface narrative of the sculpture. There's reference to 19th century stories of like sexual trafficking of women as like kind of the loot won in war. But of course, like it was also recognizable in the 19th century as a figure that's speaking to the crisis of enslavement, of slavery and abolition. The controversies around the image were entirely hitched, however, to the nudity of the figure. And in some of the public exhibitions of the work, there would be separate viewing hours, for example, for men and then for women and children. And the sculpture might actually be like modified to protect the modesty of the female viewers. And then you can see too, just this illustration of 19th century exhibition of the sculpture. You can see the context of it as well, right? Insofar as you have show Indians on display behind her, right? So you get the sense of her as kind of part of a carnival, right? Of exotic display, which was very much part of visual culture in the 19th century. And that's kind of roughly where the sculpture was situated. It was also, patented. The artist actually commercialized this sculpture as an object, right? So it's a commodity, right? In a way that was also somewhat advanced, I'll say, for this work. In the slide presentation, there's I linked to a couple really great sources for learning more about this sculpture. Those of you who work in earlier periods will know it, but there's just fascinating scholarship on it. Okay, sorry to go to this very jarring image very suddenly. But one of the things that happened in the Marxism for Artists class, when we were talking about this work and comparing Davis's writing of the choral woman and like how we understood it, one of the things that was emerging is that as we were reading the story, it was difficult to, even though her whiteness is emphasized and underscored, like the whiteness of this sculpture, that whiteness is in a kind of crisis because of its proximity to the condition of enslavement. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say in relation to racial capitalism, right? So the whiteness of this object, right, it's strange in essence for the objectness of the sculpture. And we see that in the title, right? In what the woman's called, right? The choral woman. You have this vocal resonance with the word coal, a material that's also part of the kind of industrial scene, right, from which she emerges. And I should say too that Rebecca Harding Davis, when she was negotiating the title of this short story with editors suggested calling the story The Choral Woman. And she wrote back to them, I could see that readers would be attracted to that for its promise of an encounter with a new race of Hottentot, right? So the racialization of that figure, right, was something that Davis herself was well aware of. That just sort of affirms something that I think readers of the story definitely sense. So, we were reading these Marx and looking at this story from the emphasizing Black feminist perspectives and the kinds of things that I'm talking about with you now. And Colleen Smith observed, right, that we could think about the inversion, that formerly the naked Black captive romantically slung upside down is the abolitionist move, is the abolition movement, is a popular, right? She's thinking about the Greek slave as actually the inversion of this image. So it was a very powerful intervention in terms of our own conversations about the kind of image bank for this story. Insofar as this is the primary image, right, that Powers, right, are responding to and appropriating, right, and repurposing. This is a different abolitionist image, right? I'm sorry, I'm getting kind of distracted as I look into it because it takes you into a whole other world of 19th century American writing. But I thought this was for me a perspective on the story that really turned my own understanding of how to read it inside out, right? But I just also wanted to share with you, more images from the contemporary reception of the Greek slaves. So for those of you who don't know this history, to say that that it's shadowed in its reception, right, by cartoons and commentary, right, that knew, right, that on some level that Powers' sculpture is really, right, about something else. And that figure of the female nude in the Greek slave is itself a reference to coffle display, right? Meaning the display, a parade of people within are being transported to a slave market, right? So the objectness of the choral woman, again, right, is strange because she's removed from the slave market and put onto the factory floor, right? And you're like, what do we do with that? So, and just want to point here to another 19th century kind of point of reference, John Bell's The Daughter of Eve or the American Slave, which was displayed at an exhibition at Yale, like actually positioned facing Powers' sculpture. So here I'm back here. So let me just see. I'm just going through just to see where I am. I'm going to go back up to the text for a bit. And I think I'm actually kind of getting close to time. Elizabeth, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be fine if we transition maybe in a couple minutes so we
Yes.
have time for questions. But I
Great.
don't want to cut you off, but if it feels like it's coming to an end anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the share so I can sort of talk out like kind of, so this is, all like, in a sense, right, I've just given you a very kind of like accelerated orientation to a story as I would teach it. And it's, kind of like what I want people to see from this, right, is that the story offers us a really interesting and helpful kind of point of entry into thinking about the important or like appreciating in essence the importance of the term racial capitalism, which I haven't like defined or offered you any kind of a discussion of, but which I think we can access in discussion, to like this kind of crisis in the relationship of the art object to the market, the economy, and also to labor. And so I just want to like, part of the history of life in the iron mills as a short story, right, is an already existing discourse at that point where you have activists trying to theorize the problem of wage labor, which they're narrating often as wage slavery, and even positioning as like worse than slavery. There's a scholar, a writer named Orestes Bronson, who in 1840 writes a text, I think it's called The Laboring Classes, which is a polemic, where he's like, of course I'm an abolitionist, right? But he argues that wage slavery is worse than like racialized slavery because in essence that the white worker, right, that imagines that he's free, and then he enters into the workforce, right, and then discovers that he's not. And so that there's this kind of moment of disillusionment, a stripping of liberty that happens when you clock in, like for your job. Now, that's like a violent negation, right? It's like a presentation of slavery as like a static state and not as a state in which one is like, it's an ongoing form of subjection. Slavery only exists, right, as a product of a whole system of racialized terror in which, people, white people are enlisted, right, as enforcers of it, right? However they feel, right? In West Virginia, in Virginia at that time, you had to, like white people, whether they owned slaves or not, had to participate in slave patrols. And so if you were wealthy, you paid for that. And then if you were not, you actually did that work yourself, right? So, that kind of a writing begins to set up across the 19th century a disavowal of racialized forms of slave labor, right, as having any relationship to the condition of the wage laborer. And one of the things I find interesting about that story is how that sculpture seems to kind of be like a node or like a threshold for entering into the space in which we might begin to think these things together. Even if in the story, perhaps that sculpture operates as an object through which that disavowal is made, right? It's something that allows us to start to kind of like tease out and think about that process of disavowal. And so, one thing that I do want to share from the story itself is, I'm going to go back to share screen. It's that there is in the story, there's this moment where you have Hugh, like when Hugh, this artist laborer, is arrested and thrown in jail. He looks out the window of his cell onto what I imagine is like the town square, and there's a market, and knowing now a little bit about the map of, Wheeling, Virginia, it's entirely possible he was looking at that market building, right, from which slave auctions were actually conducted. But he's seeing people like at a market shopping, and he spies a tall mulatto girl following her mistress, her basket on her head. She crossed the street just below and looked up. She's laughing, but when she caught sight of the haggard face peering out through the bars, suddenly grew grave and hurried by. A free, firm step, a clear-cut olive face with a scarlet turban tied on one side, dark shining eyes, and the head of the basket poised, filled with fruit and flowers, under which the scarlet turban and bright eyes looked out, half shadowed. The picture caught his eye. It was good to see a face like that. He would try tomorrow and cut one like it. Tomorrow. He drew down the tin, trembling. He has a piece of tin, which he's about to use to slit his wrist, and covered his face with his hands. When he looked up again, the daylight was gone, right? So, knowing now a little bit more about the history of Wheeling, Virginia, he's almost certainly looking at an enslaved woman, right, who's a domestic servant. And that is most reasonable reading if you're going to think about that story like historically. And then you also have, right, she's an object of aesthetic attention, right, and aesthetic interest from Hugh. And for me, that actually is that moment of a kind of disavowal being enacted, like it's a moment of recognition made in the story, and also a kind of a disavowal, right, as she seems like horrified, right, by him, and by the idea of him behind those bars. Like she doesn't want to think about it, right? And yet he's thinking about her. You know, there's a risk in the story, I think, of like kind of setting up and reinforcing the kinds of points that Bronson was making, like insofar as she's representing Hugh's position as, in essence, like I don't want to say the story is like, you know, producing an economy of competing forms of social death, right? But in essence, you know, she is kind of putting up that kind of white wage worker, right, as in a state of a carceral space that is, you know, much like more precarious, right, than that of the enslaved domestic servant. But that is what's happening in that scene, right? So anyway, okay, so this isn't like a completed project or a completed thought even, but rather a partial annotation of an 1861 short story in which we have an artist, meaning Rebecca Harding Davis, this writer, like, you know, taking up the question of like, what are the obligations, not only of the capitalist, right, to that artist worker, but of the writer, right, sitting in this kind of overdetermined space of the contact zone of an industrialized city in a slaveholding state, right? Like, to what is the place of art? What is the place of the work of art and the art object, right? One thing that doesn't happen in this story is that object does not enter into an economy, right? There is no like kind of market, like in which that object is, you know, going to be taken up. If the story was written maybe even 30 years later, I think that would be part of it. And that is something that you start to see in like American realist literature, you know, the relation, more explicit kind of dramatization of the crisis in the relationship between the artist and the market. And I think today, like for me, one of the things that's happening, and I say this as somebody who works as an organizer within an art space, and then also as a critic and a scholar who's had always a very difficult relationship to art history, you know, like some might say that, I mean, you know, certain articulations of art history, because for me, you know, there's a heart of the discipline that is always, you know, sort of partly also my heart. But, you know, like some might say that, you know, if I'm in an English department and not an art history department, that's because I started my, you know, career as a feminist studies and, you know, queer studies scholar. It's probably more true that it's the Marxism of my work, right? Because, you know, when I first started trying to work with art history, meaning as an undergraduate at Rutgers University, I took art history, like kind of the big lecture classes. And I was also, you know, studying, you know, Marxist political theory. And I had a kind of revolt, like an inner revolt around the culture of connoisseurship, which was really kind of the dominant pedagogical model for an encounter with the field in the 1980s, as was the case for me. And that just wasn't me. I couldn't find the space to inhabit those kinds of that particular contradiction I needed to stage elsewhere in my life. I think what we're seeing now, right, is the result. I mean, I think obviously what we're seeing right now is the result of years and years and years of activism of people from inside, right, and on the edges of and outside arts institutions, as we bring in the kinds of questions that Davis is actually asking in her work, right, from like a kind of left white liberal abolitionist kind of sort of stance, right, in the 19th century, right? But you see like those kinds of questions and concerns actually becoming this preoccupating concerns of curatorial projects within museums, right? And that as we have artists, you know, for example, Black feminist artists who are taking up questions of like race, gender, labor, value, violence, right? Genocidal levels of violence, right? Like, or as you have decolonial artists who are kind of confronting the colonial structures of the museum, the effects of that reverberate because the contradiction between doing that inside the gallery and then what structures the institution is too much to bear, right? That the institution itself kind of trembles, right? With the tensions that are generated around that, which is the point, right? So I'm personally really excited by what's happening around Strike MoMA and around these efforts to confront the philanthropic structures of the kind of like most elite institutions. I'm very curious about what happens there. Although I will say, as somebody who's worked in quite different spaces, you know, I think the sites of our struggle tend to be, meaning human resources, are very granular and much smaller insofar as our entire operating budget is probably the budget for a certain kind of like fancy lunch at MoMA. So I'm going to stop there because there's lots I want to make room for discussion and questions. So.
That's a great place to stop. I love the full circle. So we have some comments and questions already. So I have some thoughts as well, but I'm going to skip ahead to what's happening in the chat. So first comment by Sam. Wow, this talk has my mind buzzing. Thank you so much. I'm so compelled by your discussion of sculpture as form. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about translation, medium, letters to medium, marble, stone, ink, and how the use of material structures, the values, racial, political, financial, social, aesthetic presented. Yeah. And thinking particularly of Edmonia Lewis's sculptures and how her place as a Black and Indigenous woman during the 19th century was so incredibly prohibited that she went to Rome to develop a kind of classical style. Her works give rise to an aspirational quality where racial types marked by a proximity to and departure from kinds of whiteness and femininity that sculpture itself envisions. She is still in the category of the human, of course, but I still think her translation of the term is dynamic in relation to the translations at play in the life of the iron mills and other sculptural works you discuss.
And with more time, we would have done a tour through her work. She actually shared studio space with Powers. So, and Powers is a really important example for thinking about actually protecting the economics around your work. That would be something I'd want to know more about in terms of her relationship to the protection of the conditions of her labor. And notes that she may have taken from him on that front. One thing that one finds, say, for example, if you're looking at the letters of painters, say French painters in the around this time from I guess 1860s forward, when you're talking about Impressionism and painters who were working in an explicit sense of opposition to institutions, but also in relation, kind of navigating patronage and the emergence of popular visual culture and the like. Around that period, late 19th, early 20th century, you find really different kinds of worries from studio-based visual artists who make objects and writers, right? And they each have kind of a story, an anxiety dream about the situation of their integrity in relation to the market. This was really the subject of my dissertation, actually, because they often narrate that as a form of prostitution. And then laced through even kind of the contemporary discourse of that period was kind of a racial sexual anxiety around prostitution as a social disease, but also around kind of scaremongering around white slavery, which we are seeing again, actually, in this kind of fascist moment, right? The child sex trafficking stuff. So it's a thing, right? When you see a certain kind of defensive reaction formation, a turn to a very particular kind of figure of sexual exploitation around which conservative energies can consolidate themselves. So the figure of the Greek slave, one could see her as a figure expressing something like the correct posture for the artist as they approach the market, right? Insofar as it's reluctant, non-consensual, and then also non-solicitous, right? And that her gaze is, pointed slightly downward. She's not actually, there's not although she's on display and her beauty is on display, it's not volitional, right? So there's this weird way in which that work and works like it kind of function, right? And so that's the source of the scandal, say, for example, of Manet's Olympia, right? Is that it names prostitution, right, as this kind of structuring, it's got this structuring force in understanding the painting, right, as a work of art, right, that's allegorized through a white woman and a Black woman who are positioned in this relationship to each other, right, in a service economy. So sculptures themselves, right? I can't help, I'm kind of vulgar and simple-minded in a way, right? Because you have a body right there, an object that's being that for you. So there's a lot of course, really rich criticism around, right, that kind of theatricality, right? And the figure as we encounter it. And as we encounter, right, the sculptural figure as bodies ourselves, in the way in which we are kind of called to our bodies in the confrontation with sculpture, right? And obviously we have hugely important examples of this in Black feminist work and in the moment, right? And what might say like a major re-theorization, right, of the scene of the encounter between the object and the spectator that's happening from a Black feminist perspective in particular. But one thing that might surprise people is that writers were convinced they had it worse, right? Because for writers, like the literary market is like a succubus that enters into like the brain, right? That there's a penetration of the body in terms of like it's like the work isn't localized, materialized as a single thing, right? That's externalized from the writer and the reader. And so instead, what you have in the relationship between author and reader, right, is this thing called the text, which is more like a bedroom, you know. So like that it's so intimate that once that text enters into the literary marketplace, the scene of that intimacy is really profound. And so, the way in which writers imagine the marketplace and the relationship to their writing was really disturbed, I'll say, because of that. So Davis is kind of navigating that in her own way, but Davis had a real axe to grind against like the male transcendentalists of her time. And so like, because there was a desire to, in essence, or an envisioning of the aesthetic turn as kind of emerging from natural forms, but transcending them. So there's this kind of movement upward, right, within transcendentalism that even the name signifies, which she objected to violently, and as a woman, and I was very explicit about this in her work and actually in the story too. And so for her, like the objectness of the choral woman, I would say, right, is really important in that story, right? That they touch it, right? That it's choral, right? And there's actually quite a bit of language that describes that for you. So
that's actually a really perfect transition to the next question in the chat, which is, just thinking about the tension between creative written work and creative visual work. Esteban Pulido asks, what writing today would you think might function in the same way as Life in the Iron Mills, where language and fiction is it draws in while also offering a distanced reading of what we are experiencing today?
Yeah, I mean, Life in the Iron Mills belongs to a tradition that extends into the now of a kind of documentary fiction. So, it sits alongside, a 19th century important point of reference for it would be Friedrich Engels's The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844. I don't know if she read that or not, but there's also, and I've been racking my brain trying to remember, there's an American equivalent that's less well known. But Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right, is a novel that was written on the back of an investigative journalistic project meant to reveal the working conditions of people working in meatpacking in Chicago. And of course, that kind of continues like up to the now. I mean, when I've taught this, now this is so old because you could probably only watch this on like VHS, but there was this television series called, is it The Corner? Now I've forgotten. It's based on it's a journalist, it's a work of the book is a work of journalism that explores the economy, the political economy, and the life around a Baltimore corner, and in terms of the drug trade and the impact of policing, right, and drug trafficking on a very local community. And so there's like a 10-episode fictionalization, right, kind of like off of that, right? It's not documentary. It's presented as fiction, but it's actually grounded in this documentary effort. And it's very intense. I think this was I think this evolved into, I can't remember if it's The Wire. I think The Wire's genealogy is in that. But The Corner was grimmer. It was like a Zola novel, right? I mean, it is really hard, right? Because when you look at the lives of working poor people, the stories are hard and there's no redemption, right? Like anything good is like an accident, right? And those kind of happy accidents don't necessarily fall upon you because you deserve them, right? So, that's a major characteristic of realism and naturalism and, narrative form, right? Is that bad things happen to good people, in essence. And they're also, though, too, tend to, this is, Fred Jameson's writing around realism of this period. you know, one of the things that interests him is how like capital is something you sense but can never know. And then he's interested in the way in which certain kinds of novels kind of give you a glimpse of that. You know, and I would say there's a lot of art making now that does that, right? And this is like places where people are really kind of trying to kind of trace, like even just say, for example, art projects that are trying to hold institutions accountable, the very ways in which those can feel frustrating and doomed as efforts, right? That there's a very intense kind of political energy that collects around that I would say is very similar to Life in the Iron Mills as a story. I mean, the woman began her literary career with the story of an artist for whom work is impossible, right? And then she, like, I would say she worked from that position from then on, right? Yeah, anyway.
I think we unfortunately have to wrap up. We're at time. I know it went so quickly, but that's such a moving image to leave us with, I think, especially I just personally really relate to that, right? How do we think through from a position or begin from position, right, of artists thinking about life and what's possible, right? How do we, yeah.
One thing I wanted to share is like the Marxism for Artists project, you know, that was like several months long and we read a lot. At the top of the scroll for this session, you'll find in the chat some links there that'll let you access some of the materials. These were organized through human resources, but using my UCR Zoom benefits and to do like 2-hour sessions. We're going to do, I want to do 2 sessions of this centered on currency. And this is partly like, we're going to read like Marx on money, and then hopefully try to set up a conversation about cryptocurrency and NFTs. And so people who are interested in joining in that conversation, you can reach out to my UCR address and I'll make sure to put you on the list for that. That'll be in the summer. And we're going to read some Gisbert Poir, and then we're also going to do a session of, I don't know what we're going to call it, but it's like Indigenous Studies for Artists too. So, but, you know, we're just trying to make more school happen in nicer ways. But many of you might really enjoy the currency and NFT thing because, I mean, we're not going to focus totally on NFTs, but what's challenging about NFTs is also, it's like, it helps to have an understanding about what currency is, what money is, what happens when money is a commodity. What does that mean? Yeah.
That sounds amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for putting your contact information in the chat. I'm sure many will be in touch, myself included. And yeah, thank you for a wonderful keynote and thank you all for your questions. And now let's turn it back to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I just want to extend again my thanks to Jennifer for that really wonderful presentation and for your generosity in sharing that with us, but also inviting us to continue to think with you about these questions. There's nothing left for me to do except to thank everyone for their participation in this conference, for those of you who have listened in with us. And I just really want to, say thank you. This has been a labor of love for me, and it's been amazing to hear all of these brilliant talks. If anyone has questions, thoughts, comments for the speakers, you're very welcome to reach out to me. I can pass them on, likewise to the research forum or even to the speakers individually. I can speak for myself when I say I would be, it would be wonderful to hear from you and to keep this an ongoing dialogue. So thank you all. This is the end of our conference, and I'm really grateful to everyone for their work. Thank you.